All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for tuning into our first interview. This is where we're going to start interviewing each month. I think we're doing one every week, doing interviews with different wellness advocates in the community. So today we're grateful and we're welcoming Miss Danielle Smith. She's the Executive Director for the National Association of Social Workers for the Ohio chapter. So Danielle, we're so excited, so please introduce yourself.
Hello, thanks for having me on. My name is Danielle Smith. I am the Executive Director of NASW Ohio chapter. I am a social worker. I've been primarily doing macro work in my career as a social worker, but through NASW I get the privilege of working with social workers from across the state and knowing a little bit about a lot of things in practice. So proud to be a social worker and proud to be with NASW to try to make social work better for ourselves and for those that we work with.
Now, Danielle, we might have lay persons listening, not necessarily practitioners. So can you just briefly explain real quick what macro social work means?
Yeah, so social workers can work in pretty much any setting. So we have social workers like you doing mental health. We have social workers working one-on-one with people or families. Then we have social workers who work in administration or policy and kind of with a broader scope of the work that they're doing or the application that they're doing. And so we call that macro. But most social workers have elements of all of that in what they do. I just happen to be really focused on macro practice as a social worker.
Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying for us.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
So if you didn't already know and you haven't gathered now, Kelsi and I are also both social workers. So NASW is kind of our guiding source for everything we do to make sure we're doing efficient and effective and evidence-based and ethical practice, right? So NASW has been involved in ensuring all of those things along with advocating for equal rights, human rights, gender, and all these different inequalities for decades. So right now, obviously, we wanted to bring you on because of the recent uprising in social movements, cultural movements, and really talk about NASW and, if you're willing to share personal perspectives on those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously in 2020, we've had this kind of reigniting of a centuries old flame of activism for racial justice. And this work started a long time ago. In 1619, the first group of stolen folks from Africa were brought to stolen land that the United States later became. And the people who are most directly impacted by injustice, Black folks, Indigenous folks, people of color, have been literally fighting for their survival since. And we sort of, as white folks, tune in every once in a while and get angry and get involved, even though we directly benefit and sustain those systems of power, of oppression in the in-between time. So I think we're paying a lot of attention right now. But this is sort of just a moment in history where we're doing that focused work. So it's important for us to think about how we sustain it, particularly as white folks. So obviously, as white women, we're, sort of showing up as like tourists in this moment of like, oh, hey, this is important. But it's important to think through like, every day of what this looks like for us and how we can definitely do better. And I appreciate really all of the work that activists have done for a long, long time. And it's pretty ridiculous that we sort of rely on folks of color to keep our attention when their lives are at stake. So, we often hear that from people that, it takes the video deaths of George Floyd or the news of Breonna Taylor or Tony McDade or Jacob Blake to grab our attention. But it's pretty obvious that it's happening constantly in the communities that we live in. And so that's really the work of white people, right? Like it has to be white people acknowledging that all of us, no matter how like well-intentioned we are or how woke we think we are, benefit from these systems. And we have to do better at sort of holding ourselves accountable And that means leading, not necessarily leading the work, following the lead of people most directly impacted, but following their lead and doing the hard work ourselves. Roxane Gay, who's definitely a thought leader on racial justice and the intersectionality of oppression, was on a podcast recently and said, the only thing Black folks have to do or should do right now, or I suppose should have to do, is sit and wait for the reparations check to show up. And I really think of that as my sort of focus right now as a social worker is how do I make sure that I'm constantly disrupting the circles I'm in as a white person to push for social justice, to push for racial justice.
Absolutely.
I think that's just acknowledging our own, privilege. I feel like it's such a discussion that, is taboo, but I'm glad that, this movement has, brought more discussion to us, our responsibility as white individuals, acknowledging what our own privilege is and saying like, hey, I want to be that open mind, a sponge. And, I think the biggest thing for me, personally in this part of where we're at in the movement is me educating myself, because I live, southeastern Ohio and no, real population of individuals of color. And even my caseload is, pretty much all white, individuals. So I think that's a good point as to us as white individuals. What is our, responsibility in this?
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we continually gain that knowledge and then also apply it in action? Because I think it can be easy to be overwhelmed by all the things that we can learn. And it's the same thing in what we're describing as macro social work as micro one-on-one practice, right? Is not positioning ourselves as the expert over the client. The client knows their situation, their life experience. They are the expert. And so how do we hear that and know that we all always have to have an air of humility as we go about this work as white folks, but not letting that sort of gulf of information that we need to know stop us from beginning to take action.
Yeah, absolutely. And this just sparked a point in my head. I've always had a problem with the word cultural competency when they have these trainings and expectations that we'll have cultural competency. I think that's unrealistic. I don't care how much you travel the world or how much research you do or how much you try to live in someone else's shoes. It's really just being aware and empathetic. I think cultural empathy and awareness are just so crucial to who we are, realizing that we all come from different backgrounds and you have to compromise,
Totally. Yeah, it implies an endpoint that we're, get a certificate that says now we're competent in this. When, even if you think about your own cultures, the different identities you have, there's no way we're competent even in every sort of experience within those cultures. So we would have no hope of truly ever being this expert in other folks' identities and culture. And I do think, though, that there is merit in learning about people's culture. Those the workshops that we sort of poke fun at of oh, here are the characteristics of a certain culture or something. Those definitely shouldn't be the main thing that we're doing, but having an appreciation and curiosity for other people and realizing that's a strength of folks is the culture and traditions that they bring. And that sort of kind of for me gets into this white supremacy characteristic of being colorblind, where we sort of we're taught to be polite and as if we don't notice someone's culture, race, ethnicity, and sort of erase the person that is in front of us. And a lot of that I think comes from, as white folks, the fact that we don't do a lot of that self-analysis. So we don't think about the culture that we have, right? I went to a workshop once and the icebreaker question for white accomplices in this work was, what do you like about being white? And, it's like a panic inducing question for white folks, because if any answer you think of is connected to someone else's oppression, right? That we can navigate the world with relative safety is because there are other groups of people where we know that's not true. But because we have nothing, my family is recent immigrants to the United States, but I know nothing about the culture that they came from, even though it's only 2 generations back. And so that sort of raised me with this concept that I don't have a culture, or in reality, what that means is that, like, I believe that I am the dominant, unspoken culture, which means that anyone who is not raised in this white, heterosexual based, gender role conforming based system, is like judged against it as if this is like the ruler in which everyone else is judged. So doing that reflection for ourselves and understanding sort of our own like cultural competency for ourselves is really important as we think about our role, particularly as white folks in this work.
Absolutely. Okay. So we had a script. I think we skipped around. I'm okay. You have so much knowledge. Okay. So how were you personally, or have we as a profession been impacted by the recent Black Lives Matters movements, the media coverage? How has that kind of impacted us?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think that it feels different, but it's always been these moments where I think it feels different. So I first want to acknowledge that almost my excitement's not the right word, because it's a really heavy moment, right? We're in a summer, coming to an end of a summer of a lot of deaths from, police murders, from white vigilante murders, from COVID that's disproportionately affecting people who have been historically oppressed. It is heavy, but I'm also, somewhat excited that it feels like things that weren't possible before are more in reach than before. So I am optimistic that this is somewhat different, or feels somewhat different to me. And part of that, I think, has become how much social work is being named in this moment, in a lot of really complex and complicated ways. So, pretty soon after the murder of George Floyd, there were a lot of folks, including the president, who were mentioning social work. So, we've always been a profession that's mentioned, I think, as having a unique skill set during crises that is perhaps more humane than other approaches, or has, more effectiveness than other approaches. And so in May, the end of May, after George Floyd was killed, we suddenly were popping up all over the place, where people were both calling up for us as part of the solution to racist policing, and then also complicit in those same systems of oppression. And it's uncomfortable, particularly as social workers in a profession that I love. But because I love it, I think we can do better, and that we can be critical of ourselves while still loving the work that we do. And that is what ultimately separates us from professional groups or other entities that refuse to be introspective at this moment of how we are perpetuating the same harm. Because when we think of things like disproportionate deaths in the healthcare system, or wildly disproportionate rates of infant mortality by race, or the fact that child welfare has disproportionate family separation for families of color, to the point where it's been labeled the Jane Crow system, like, we have to also look at how our actions cause harm. And so for me, this has been this like tipping point where we can't just ignore their reality for what is actually happening in this country. And as the representative of social workers in Ohio, we have to do everything that we can to both address this externally and then also internally to social work.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. Do you is there any area, pretty specific areas, that you feel like the Black Lives Matter movement has really sparked significant change that, we have, or just brought more awareness, more so to?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. The term Black Lives Matter was started by a group of Black femmes I think around 2016. I'm not exactly sure the first date that term was applied, but it was like a slogan essentially. But it's not that old, right? For us to all like have adopted this like saying. And it's an organization in some sense. There are some organizations that have that title, but for the most part, it's an organic movement of people talking about racism as it influences or directs most of the systems in the United States. So, in a relatively short amount of time, under that label of Black Lives Matter, there have been some of the longest sustained direct actions in history in the United States. So after George Floyd's death, Breonna Taylor's death, these protests are pretty high up on the list of length of sustainability or sustained action, which is really exciting because I do believe that direct action causes results, and we've seen some of those results, albeit in a really tough political climate. In Ohio, we have a very conservative state legislature. We have many people on a local level, like prosecutors or judges, who also come from more of a conservative background. But we're still seeing, a willingness to look at things differently. Hearing from small towns that they're reaching out to social workers, or social workers are reaching out to city councils or to the police themselves, or doing things in their organizations. There's a lot of organizations that are looking at how they end collaborations with police. So obviously in social work, we have a lot of times where we're reaching out to police to do welfare checks or transportation during a crisis, or even being security in our buildings. And can we look at flipping that around so that we're not involving people who carry a firearm and have a questionable system of accountability, that we're building systems with more accountability, more oversight, more training, and using the social work skill set, right? Like social workers are the best folks at de-escalation, I know. And so we really should be the ones thinking through what do we do when our physical safety is at risk. And I don't think the answer has to be that a police intervenes. I think that we have the tools that we need 99% of the time. So it's already pushed a lot of organizations to do that work. It is slower legislatively on a state level. I wish that we were talking about things that more progressive states have done. The nice thing about NASW is I have a colleague in a chapter in every state in the country. So we know what Minnesota is doing, what New York is doing, what California is doing. And it's really exciting. Minnesota City Council has openly talked about defunding police and moving money from that system to community systems of care. We've heard some of that talk in Ohio, not as much on a city level, but there is some openness to that on more of a local level in Ohio. There is some discussion on a state level of how we can look at things like qualified immunity, which allows police officers pretty much to commit violent acts outside of like a normal course of action, and not face consequences for that. That's how many folks were, we've had pretty solid evidence that they've done a violent action while in the course of their work as a police officer, why they didn't end up with any criminal or civil penalties. So I'm hopeful that things will happen. I think working in Ohio for as long as I have, I've sort of changed from expecting or assuming that the state legislature will do the right thing, and looking at instead at social workers ourselves as being able to change what's sort of like in our lane of affectability, and then also the local levels of government. And of course, we have an election coming. So obviously in November, we have an election where everyone from the president to local local elected officials are on the ballot. In Ohio, all 99 House of Representatives are on the ballot, half of our Senate, lots of local races that make a huge difference for these issues, both for social workers and for social justice. So, it's a time where we can make immediate action happen, and we don't have to wait for someone to give us the step-by-step instructions. We know what needs to be done, and we should figure out how we incorporate this work every single day into what we're doing. And often that work is really uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to push our organizations to do these things, to talk about white supremacy culture within social work. None of this is easy, but it requires us to stay in it despite the difficult nature of the work that has to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're uncomfortable regardless. So
Absolutely.
It's either you're uncomfortable and you're in denial, or you're uncomfortable and you do something about it.
Danielle, what can our listeners do as individual members of society? So not just us as professionals, because we know we're going to have a lot of different, folks listening. So just individual members of society, we all can have a positive impact for, future generations to come. So just in regard to the inequality and justice and human rights, what do you think that just each individual person can do to make a difference?
Yeah, I think all of us have to do this work, and that's the only way that we'll ever make a change, because we're literally working against these huge systems that were designed to hold power for the people who have it and keep the rest of us sort of working toward their hoarding of power. And so that isn't going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen through legislation alone. It means all of us showing up and really figuring out how we change the systems that we're in. So first, like we already talked about, it is learning. I think as white folks, particularly if you haven't had a lot of exposure to the lived experience of people who are oppressed, it is really easy now to get that information. There are so many places where you can find information for where you're at and push yourself along. We sort of refer to this as our learning edges. So like, what do we not know about enough? Like, for example, I feel like I never learned anything about disability justice or the activists within the disabled community who really pushed for change and did really radical, amazing stuff. And so I've been trying to learn more about that experience. But I think for a lot of white folks, we don't know what it's like to be Black in the United States, and we have to learn. Some of my favorite resources for that is Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy book and workbook. It has a 30-day sort of curriculum for how white folks can learn more about our perspectives and how that influences the way we see the world. You can watch Erica Hart and Ebony Donnelly's webinars on social justice. Just watched 2 of those recently, and they really do a fantastic job of talking about intersectionality. And also, we should pay those people, right? Like, we should look at who we pay for content. It's not easy to do podcasts and things like this. So when we're consuming content and gaining from it, we should pay those people for that content. And also related to pay, like as white folks, we have to make sure that we're not like perpetually benefiting from oppression. And this is tough because we sort of have an inherent conflict of interest as social workers in that, like, we directly benefit from oppression, right? Like, we have jobs because people suffer. We have jobs because we haven't adequately looked at inequality and inequity in the United States. And so that leads a lot of time where we're like so uncomfortable questioning these systems that we won't, because it affects us so directly. So like thinking through that and thinking about a world where maybe our jobs don't look like the jobs that we have now, and how we can still be like working for a better world, and being mindful that it might mean that our work shows up differently for us. And then part of that too, related to just like our work and being paid, is it's important that as white social workers that we're not like claiming expertise in anti-racism, to allow for people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color to be paid to do this work, and not to like assume, right, like that, oh, like Black folks are so busy and they're being called upon so much for the emotional labor of talking about this that I should shoulder this work as a white person. And like perhaps that's true, but like we should definitely ask before we make assumptions about that. And when there's money involved, this is something that happens a lot with NASW, is like I'll be approached and asked to do training for anti-racism, and I'll do it if they don't have money to pay, because I don't want to have Black folks doing that work uncompensated. But if it's a paid gig, you should definitely pass the mic and look at ways you can pass the mic more often. And that's true for anybody who is doing this work, whether you're a social worker or not. I think it takes a lot of courage to do this. It's uncomfortable. You'll probably make people mad when you question why things are happening the way that they are. And in general, we don't like to cause conflict as humans, so we avoid it. But that's why we just keep staying in these same sort of patterns and don't break out of deaths and other things that are happening, is because we are uncomfortable with the idea of challenging people who have different opinions, or different positions than we do. And that is hard to keep in this work and stay well yourself. And that's a struggle, right? Like this is like an ultra marathon. We have to stay in it for a long time. It's just like our life's work. It's not going to end anytime before then. So sustaining us while also being brave and having courage is important. So I would say, like, show up to protest, be safe during COVID, give money to organizations and individuals doing this work, use your power and privilege, and find ways to just disrupt any moment where things are happening. You hear a microaggression happen, disrupt that. If your organization routinely is passing over Black folks for promotions, question that. If your neighbor has a Trump flag in his yard, talk to them. I mean, this is our responsibility right now. This is literally our ethical responsibility as social workers and just as human beings, is to say that we cannot accept this happening as it is.
Yeah, and just the most layperson of laypersons things you can do. Support Black-owned businesses.
Yes.
If you're going to go on Etsy and buy some cute earrings, find a Black-owned Etsy shop, okay? So that's one of the easiest things that I've been able to do personally. And, talk to people of color and see what they need, right? Whether that's they want to hear you listen to, or they want you to listen to them and their experiences, or they want to be an advocate. Just, have those conversations. Yeah. Danielle, can you send me those links so I can have them in the show notes, those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. Like for the books that I mentioned.
Can have them. Yeah, perfect. And then before we let you go, any other thoughts about everything we've talked about, Danielle?
I sort of said this a second ago, but taking care of yourself is important in this work. To find those moments that give you joy and help to sustain in it is really important, because it can be easy to just sort of, curl up right now and say it's too much and I'm not going to engage. I don't know enough. I don't have enough time. I don't see the ability for one person to make a difference. And that's how we stay in the same place is by this all or nothing thinking that I have to be the leader or nothing at all, when just showing up, even if it feels like you're not doing much by standing in a protest, that does matter. It shows folks, white folks, people who are in power, that there is a sustained number of people who care about this, and it shows to people who are oppressed that they're not alone. They're not being just forgotten in what's happening. So just show up. That's the most important thing we can do.
Yeah, be an ally.
Yes, and it's it's so big. It's so much bigger than us. So I hear so many people that I've talked to, whether it's clients in my practice, coworkers, friends. I hear all the time, we get focused on all of the stuff that we can't do, or we wish we could do, or that we want to do, or, so I like that, focusing on, even if it's small things, if all of us are doing something small, it can, it makes a presence for all of these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think sometimes just because we're so busy that if we don't have structure for accountability, it might not happen. So I really try to have like one thing a week that I'm working on as a goal, like a protest I'm going to show up to, an email I'm going to send, a conversation I'm going to have, and every week sort of like journal down what I'm going to do so that it's not just something that can fall to the wayside. It's something that I'm actively committed to.
Oh, I love that so much.
Yes, Kelsi's brain loves that organization.
Yeah,
those are realistic, practical
down,
things that we can do. So there you go. When you leave this podcast today, go set a weekly reminder to take action. Danielle, thank you so much for being our guest today. Yes. We're so thankful to have you, and we wish you the best of luck on this continued fun journey through an outbreak now and all the other issues going on in the world. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here to have this conversation.
All right. Stay tuned and make sure you like, comment, subscribe so you don't miss out on the recent episodes. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.